The fluorescent lights of the cybersecurity firm buzzed with that persistent hum that had become the soundtrack to Ethan Cole's existence. It was late January 2025, and outside the glass walls of the downtown Chicago office, snow fell in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the city in white. Inside, the air conditioning fought against overheating servers, creating a perpetual state of artificial climate that matched the artificial nature of everything Ethan had been doing for the past 3 years. He sat hunched over 3 monitors, his reflection ghosting across the dark screens between lines of code, and he barely recognized himself anymore. Dark circles had taken permanent residence under his eyes, and his once athletic frame had thinned from too many skipped meals and an unhealthy relationship with energy drinks. His fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, tracing the digital footprints of a ransomware attack that had hit a regional hospital chain. It was routine work, the kind that paid well and kept him busy, but it did nothing to fill the gnawing emptiness that had been growing inside him since his divorce 18 months ago. Ethan's obsession with the deep web hadn't started suddenly. It had crept up on him gradually, like frost forming on a window, until one day he looked up and realized he couldn't see through the glass anymore. It began with legitimate research, tracking criminals who used Tor networks and encrypted messaging to coordinate their activities. But somewhere along the way, his professional interest had morphed into something darker, more personal. He found himself logging on late at night, navigating through layers of encryption, not because he had to, but because he needed to. There was something about the anonymity, the raw humanity stripped of social pretense, that fascinated and horrified him in equal measure. In the deep web, people revealed their true selves, their darkest desires and deepest fears, and Ethan couldn't look away. He told himself he was studying human nature, understanding threats, staying ahead of the curve. But deep down, he knew he was searching for something else entirely, something he couldn't quite name but felt in his bones. The office was nearly empty that Friday evening. Most of his colleagues had left hours ago, eager to start their weekends. Ethan barely noticed. He was following a thread he'd discovered earlier that week, a forum discussing encryption vulnerabilities that seemed too sophisticated for the usual conspiracy theorists and script kiddies. The participants used handles that changed frequently, and their knowledge was uncomfortably precise. One user, calling themselves Mirror Walker, had posted a challenge, a cryptographic puzzle with layers of meaning that suggested they knew more about Ethan's own work than any stranger should. The puzzle referenced a specific case he'd worked on 6 months ago, details that had never been made public. His heart rate accelerated as he decoded the message, each revelation more unsettling than the last. It wasn't a threat, exactly. It was more like an invitation or a test. The final line read simply, "We've been watching your searches, Ethan. You're looking for answers in the wrong places. If you want to see what's really happening, look deeper. But remember, once you see it, you can't unsee it." His phone vibrated, breaking his concentration. It was a text from an unknown number. "Chicago Tribune Building, tomorrow 2 p.m. 5th floor break room. Come alone. M.R." Ethan stared at the message, his analytical mind immediately cataloguing the risk factors. Unknown contact, vague instructions, potential security threat. But another part of him, the part that had been pushing him deeper into the digital underworld, felt a surge of anticipation. He Googled M.R. Chicago Tribune and found Maya Reynolds, an investigative journalist with a reputation for exposing corruption and uncomfortable truths. Her recent articles had touched on surveillance capitalism, data breaches, and the erosion of digital privacy. She'd won awards and made enemies. Ethan had actually read some of her work and found it compelling, if somewhat paranoid, but now, receiving a cryptic message from her the same night he'd been contacted by someone who knew too much about him, he couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, torn between deleting the message and responding. The office felt colder suddenly, or maybe it was just him. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in silence, hiding everything beneath a pristine white surface that would turn grey and dirty by morning. Ethan saved his work and shut down his systems with methodical precision, but his mind was racing. He thought about Sarah, his ex-wife, who had left him because, in her words, he'd become obsessed with shadows and ghosts instead of living in the real world. She wasn't entirely wrong. He'd missed anniversaries, forgotten conversations, stayed up all night chasing digital phantoms while their marriage crumbled. Now, standing alone in the empty office with the city sprawling below him, Ethan realized he was at a crossroads. He could ignore the message, forget about Mirrorwalker, go back to his safe, predictable existence of corporate cybersecurity work and carefully managed loneliness. Or he could show up tomorrow and step through a door that instinctively he knew would change everything. The rational part of his brain screamed caution, listed all the ways this could be a trap or a setup. But the other part, the part that had been leading him deeper into the deep web night after night, whispered that maybe this was exactly what he'd been searching for all along. He grabbed his coat and headed for the elevator, the decision already made, even if he wasn't ready to admit it yet. The Chicago Tribune building stood like a monument to a dying industry, its Art Deco facade weathered but dignified, surrounded by newer glass towers that seemed to mock its analog origins. Ethan arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from his military days that he'd never shaken. The security guard barely glanced at his ID as he signed in, and he took the elevator to the 5th floor with his heart hammering in a way that felt disproportionate to simply meeting a journalist. The break room was exactly what he expected, institutional and impersonal, with a coffee maker that had seen better days and motivational posters that no one actually found motivating. He was pouring himself a cup of mediocre coffee when she walked in. Maya Reynolds was smaller than he'd imagined, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that immediately assessed him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She wore jeans and a leather jacket, and there was something coiled about her posture, like someone perpetually ready to either fight or flee. "Ethan Cole," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. She didn't extend her hand. "You showed up. I wasn't entirely sure you would." Her voice carried traces of a Boston accent, flattened by years elsewhere, but still present in certain vowels. Ethan set down his coffee and met her gaze directly. "Your text was intriguing. How did you get my number?" Maya's lips quirked into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I'm an investigative journalist. Getting phone numbers is literally the easiest part of my job. Besides, you've been leaving digital breadcrumbs all over the deep web for months. You're not as invisible as you think you are." The casual revelation that she'd been tracking him should have alarmed him more than it did. Instead, he felt a strange sense of relief, like finally being seen after years of isolation. "So you brought me here to tell me I'm sloppy?" Maya shook her head and pulled out a laptop, old and covered in stickers from various activist causes and tech conferences. "I brought you here because we're investigating the same thing, just from different angles. And because someone wants us to find each other." She opened the laptop and showed him a series of screenshots, forum posts, encrypted messages that looked disturbingly similar to what he'd been seeing. 3 months ago, I started receiving tips about a network operating in the deep web that's different from the usual criminal marketplaces. Not drugs, not weapons, not even child exploitation, though God knows there's plenty of that down there. Her voice tightened with barely controlled anger. "This is something else. People are being targeted, their digital lives dissected, their real-world vulnerabilities identified. Then they're contacted, manipulated, sometimes blackmailed, but often just messed with. Psychologically tortured for no apparent reason other than someone's entertainment or some experiment I can't figure out." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. "How many victims?" Maya's eyes darkened. "That I know of? 17. But I think it's way more. These people, they don't go to the police because either they were doing something questionable themselves when they got targeted, or because what happened to them sounds so crazy that no one would believe them. One guy, a software developer in Austin, told me he started receiving messages that contained conversations he'd had in his own home when his phone was off. Another woman in Portland said someone emptied her bank account, then put all the money back with an extra $1,000 and a note that said, "We could have taken everything." Ethan's mind raced through possibilities, connecting dots. That sounds like advanced surveillance, maybe corporate espionage, or a sophisticated hacking collective. Maya nodded, but her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. That's what I thought at first. But there's something off about the pattern. It's too random, too theatrical. Real criminals are efficient. They don't play games unless there's profit in it. This feels personal, intimate, like someone's testing something or proving a point. She pulled up another file, and Ethan recognized the logo immediately, a stylized mirror with cracks running through it. "Mirror Walker," he said quietly. Maya's eyes snapped to his face. "You've seen this?" He explained about the message he'd received, the cryptographic puzzle, the unsettling accuracy of the information. Maya listened without interrupting, her fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on the table. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "They contacted me too, 6 weeks ago. Different message, same signature. They told me I was asking the right questions, but looking in the wrong places. They sent me your name, said you were close to something important." The implications hung in the air between them like smoke. Someone had orchestrated this meeting, brought them together for reasons neither of them fully understood. Ethan should have walked away right then, reported everything to his supervisors, maybe even the FBI. But he didn't. Instead, he heard himself say, "What do you want to do?" Maya's smile this time was genuine but tinged with something dark. "I want to find out who's behind this. I want to expose them. And I think you want the same thing, even if you won't admit why." She wasn't wrong. Ethan had spent months drowning in the deep web's darkness, searching for something he couldn't name. Maybe this was it. A purpose, a mission, something to fill the void that had been consuming him since his life fell apart. "There's something you should know," Maya said, her voice dropping lower. 5 years ago, I investigated a tech company for illegal surveillance. I got too close, and they destroyed my reputation, hacked my accounts, released personal information that cost me my marriage and nearly my career. It took me 3 years to rebuild. I don't trust easily anymore, and I don't take risks without good reason. Ethan understood what she was really saying, that she was as damaged as he was, that they were both running towards something dangerous because staying still was worse. "I'm divorced too," he offered, not sure why it mattered, but feeling like it did. She said I cared more about abstract threats than real people. She was probably right. Maya's expression softened fractionally. My ex said something similar, called me paranoid, obsessive, unable to let go. The thing is, Ethan, sometimes paranoia is just pattern recognition. Sometimes the shadows really are hiding something. They exchanged contact information, encrypted messaging apps, secure email protocols, the digital handshake of two people about to walk into darkness together. As Ethan left the Tribune building, the afternoon sun was already setting. Winter days being ruthlessly short in Chicago, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a combination of fear and exhilaration that reminded him of being alive. His phone buzzed with a new message from an encrypted number. "Good choice, Ethan. Now the real work begins. Check your secure server tonight at midnight. You'll find a gift waiting. Consider it a taste of what's possible. Mirror Walker." Ethan stared at the message as snowflakes began to fall again, and somewhere deep in his gut, he knew that whatever he found at midnight would be the point of no return. Midnight arrived with the kind of silence that only winter nights in Chicago can produce. The city muffled under fresh snow, the usual urban cacophony reduced to occasional distant sirens and the hum of heating systems struggling against the cold. Ethan sat in his apartment, a converted loft in a gentrifying neighborhood south of the Loop, surrounded by computer equipment that would make most corporate IT departments jealous. The space was sparse, almost monastic, with a bed he rarely used, a kitchen he barely touched, and walls covered in whiteboards filled with network diagrams and encrypted codes that made sense only to him. He'd sent Maya an encrypted message earlier explaining what he was about to do, and she'd responded immediately with a warning to document everything and to stop if anything felt dangerous. He appreciated the concern, even if he had no intention of stopping. His fingers moved across the keyboard, navigating through layers of encryption to access the secure server he maintained for sensitive work. The login process alone took several minutes, requiring biometric verification, rotating passwords, and authentication tokens. When he finally gained access, there was a single new folder waiting, labeled simply Ethan Gift. His hand hesitated over the mouse. Every instinct screamed this was a trap, that opening this file could compromise his entire system, expose his work, destroy his life. But curiosity, that insidious force that had driven him into the deep web night after night, overpowered caution. He clicked. The folder contained 3 files, a video, a document, and an audio recording. He started with the document, a text file that contained his complete digital footprint going back 5 years. Every website he'd visited, every search he'd made, every email he'd sent or received, every purchase, every location his phone had pinged, every conversation captured by smart speakers he didn't even remember having. It was comprehensive, invasive, terrifying. But what made his blood run cold was the commentary interspersed throughout, analyzing his behavior patterns, his psychological state, his deteriorating marriage, his growing obsession with the deep web. It read like a clinical study, detached and precise, as if he were a lab rat being observed by some unseen researcher. The annotations pointed out moments he'd forgotten, decisions that seemed insignificant at the time, but which, in aggregate, revealed a portrait of a man slowly unraveling. He opened the video next, his hands shaking slightly. It was surveillance footage from his own apartment, multiple angles covering every room, time-stamped over the past 6 months. He watched himself stumbling home, drunk, after his divorce was finalized. He saw himself crying at 3 a.m. while staring at his wedding photos. He witnessed countless nights of obsessive coding, talking to himself, pacing like a caged animal. The video quality was crystal clear, professionally edited, showing not just what he'd done, but capturing the progression of his isolation and desperation. The final clip showed him from earlier that same evening, preparing to access this very server, with text overlaid that read, "We see everything, Ethan. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" His apartment suddenly felt violated, exposed, as if the walls themselves were transparent. He immediately began scanning for cameras, checking outlets, light fixtures, smoke detectors, anywhere a surveillance device could be hidden. But he found nothing. Either they were too well hidden, or they'd been removed already, their purpose served. The psychological impact was the point, he realized, not the ongoing surveillance. They'd proven they could access his most private moments, and now he'd never feel safe again in his own home. The audio file was the final piece, and somehow he knew it would be the worst. He plugged in headphones, not wanting his potentially compromised apartment to hear what he was about to hear. It was a conversation, 2 voices he didn't immediately recognize, discussing him specifically. The dialogue was clinical, analytical, discussing his psychological profile, his vulnerabilities, his potential usefulness for something they called Phase 2. They mentioned Maya too, describing her as damaged but resilient, with strong investigative instincts and a pathological need to expose truth regardless of personal cost. The conversation revealed that their meeting hadn't been orchestrated by Mira Walker alone. There were others involved, an entire network of people who'd been watching both of them, guiding them together like pieces on a chessboard. One voice said, The beauty of this approach is that they'll investigate themselves into the trap. They're too curious, too broken, too desperate for meaning to stop. The other voice responded, and when they finally understand what we're really doing, they'll be too compromised to expose it without destroying themselves. It's elegant, really. Ethan ripped off the headphones, his breathing ragged, panic rising in his chest like floodwater. He grabbed his phone to call Maya, then stopped. If they were monitoring him this thoroughly, they were certainly monitoring her too. Any communication could be intercepted, analyzed, used against them. He needed to think, to approach this logically, to separate the fear from the facts. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to engage the analytical part of his brain that had served him well in combat and in cybersecurity. What did he actually know? Someone with significant resources and technical capability was targeting him and Maya. They had access to surveillance tools that suggested either government-level capabilities or a very well-funded private operation. They'd been watching for months, gathering data, building profiles, and they wanted him to know all of this. That last point was crucial. They could have remained hidden, continued their surveillance without revealing themselves, but they'd chosen to show their hand, to intimidate and provoke. Why? What did they gain from his fear and paranoia? His phone rang, Maya's encrypted number. He answered immediately. "Don't say anything specific," she said quickly, her voice tight with tension. "Just listen. I received something too. Different content, same message. We need to meet in person, somewhere we know isn't compromised. Tomorrow morning, Millennium Park by the Bean, 9 a.m. Lots of people, open space, hard to surveil effectively. Can you make it?" Ethan confirmed and ended the call, then immediately began the process of securing his systems as much as possible. He changed passwords, rotated encryption keys, ran diagnostic software looking for malware or backdoors. He found several vulnerabilities he hadn't noticed before, subtle compromises that would have given someone access to his machine without his knowledge. The sophistication was impressive and deeply disturbing. Whoever was behind this had resources and skills that rivaled nation-state actors. As dawn broke over Chicago, Ethan hadn't slept. He'd spent the night documenting everything, creating encrypted backups, setting up dead man switches that would automatically release information if he disappeared. It was paranoid behavior, the kind of thing Maya's ex-husband had probably accused her of. But paranoia, as she'd said, was sometimes just pattern recognition, and the pattern he was seeing suggested they were in deeper trouble than either of them had imagined. Millennium Park at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning in late January was surprisingly crowded, tourists bundling against the cold to take selfies with Cloudgate, the massive reflective sculpture locals called the Bean. Ethan spotted Maya immediately, standing apart from the crowds, hands shoved deep in her jacket pockets, scanning faces with the perpetual vigilance of someone who'd learned trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. He approached from the side, a basic counter-surveillance technique that felt simultaneously professional and absurd given their circumstances. They didn't greet each other with words, just a brief nod of mutual recognition before beginning to walk. The park's paths were salted but still treacherous with ice, forcing them to watch their footing while they talked, which paradoxically made the conversation feel more natural, less staged for any potential observers. Maya spoke first, her breath creating small clouds in the frozen air. "I received files too. My complete digital history, surveillance footage from my apartment, and recordings of private conversations I had with sources about this very investigation. They've been inside my life for months, maybe longer. They know things I haven't told anyone." Ethan felt a strange sense of relief that he wasn't alone in this violation, followed immediately by guilt for finding comfort in her suffering. "The audio file I received mentioned something called Phase 2. They talked about us like we were part of some experiment or operation. Does that mean anything to you?" Maya's jaw tightened. "After I received their gift last night, I couldn't sleep. I started going through all my research again, looking for patterns I might have missed. I found something. All 17 victims I've documented, plus at least a dozen more I've identified since we met. They all have something in common. They're all people who work in tech, security, journalism, or law enforcement, people with access to systems or information. And they're all isolated in some way, divorced, estranged from family, socially withdrawn. They targeted people who are vulnerable but capable, people who could be useful. The implications crashed over Ethan like cold water. They're recruiting or testing, finding people they can manipulate or control. Maya stopped walking and turned to face him directly, her eyes reflecting the grey winter sky. There's more. Last night after our call, I got another message. From Mira Walker, but different in tone. It said, "You're asking the right questions now, but you're still thinking too small. This isn't about surveillance or control. It's about evolution. We're showing you what humanity becomes when every secret is transparent, when privacy is extinct, when everyone is watching everyone else. You're not victims, you're prophets. What you do next determines whether you survive what's coming." Ethan felt dizzy, the philosophical implications competing with immediate survival instincts. That sounds like the manifesto of a true believer, someone who thinks they're doing this for a greater purpose. They resumed walking, moving toward the lake, where the water churned dark and violent against ice-covered rocks. Maya continued, "I've been thinking about that. What if this isn't a criminal operation at all? What if it's something else, a social experiment, a demonstration, maybe even a warning? The surveillance state is already here, Ethan. Governments, corporations, they're already watching everything we do. Maybe these people are just making it obvious, forcing us to confront what we've been ignoring." Ethan wanted to reject that interpretation, to categorize this as simple criminal activity that could be investigated and stopped. But his analytical mind couldn't dismiss the logic. If that's true, then what's their endgame? What do they want from us specifically? Maya pulled out her phone, showing him a new message that had arrived just minutes before they met. It was an address on the south side in Pilsen, and a time midnight tonight. They want to meet, in person. No more digital games, no more anonymous messages. They're offering to explain everything, show us what Phase 2 actually means. It's obviously a trap. Ethan studied the address, running risk assessments automatically. Industrial area, minimal foot traffic at night, easy to control access and egress. Every tactical instinct told him not to go. But we're going anyway. It wasn't a question. Maya's smile was grim. We're going anyway, because not knowing is worse than any trap they could set. Because we've already lost our privacy, our safety, our peace of mind. At this point, what else can they take? They spent the rest of the day preparing, meeting briefly at Maya's apartment to coordinate. She lived in a studio in Wicker Park, walls covered with printouts and photographs connected by red string like a detective show cliché. Except this was real, and the conspiracy wall represented actual people whose lives had been invaded and upended. They established protocols, encrypted communication every 30 minutes once they separated, dead man switches that would automatically send all their research to multiple journalists and law enforcement if they failed to check in, physical tracking devices that would broadcast their locations to trusted contacts. Maya had a friend from her Boston days, another journalist who specialized in digital rights, who agreed to serve as their failsafe. They recorded video messages explaining everything they knew, uploading them to timed servers that would release the content if they didn't cancel the publication. It was paranoid, elaborate, and probably insufficient if they were really dealing with the kind of resources they suspected, but it was something, an attempt to maintain agency in a situation where they'd been stripped of control. As midnight approached, they drove separately to Pilsen, parking several blocks from the address in case their vehicles were being tracked. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly residential with scattered light industrial buildings, many converted to artist studios and galleries. The address led them to an old warehouse, no signage, windows either boarded or painted black. The door was unlocked. Inside, the space was vast and empty, Concrete floors and exposed beams lit by a single fluorescent worklight that cast harsh shadows. In the center of the room sat 2 chairs and a table with 2 laptops. No people, no obvious cameras, just the setup and a note that read, "Sit, watch, understand." They exchanged glances, communicating in that shorthand that develops between people who've been through crisis together. Maya sat first, and Ethan joined her, their shoulders almost touching, a small comfort of human presence in the overwhelming strangeness of the moment. When they opened the laptops, identical presentations began, sophisticated multimedia explanations of what they'd stumbled into. The content was staggering in scope. Mira Walker wasn't a person. It was a collective, dozens or possibly hundreds of individuals working together, penetrating networks, gathering information, mapping the complete digital infrastructure of American society. The presentation explained that they'd been documenting the total surveillance ecosystem, proving that privacy was already extinct, that every digital interaction was monitored, stored, analyzed by governments, corporations, and now by independent actors who'd simply decided to make the invisible visible. Phase 2, the presentation explained, wasn't about hurting people. It was about education through experience, forcing individuals to confront the reality of digital existence by making their own surveillance explicit and personal. The 17 victims Maya had documented weren't chosen randomly. They were proof of concept, demonstrations that anyone could be watched, analyzed, predicted. The psychological trauma was regrettable, but necessary, the presentation argued, because humanity needed to wake up to what had already happened, to stop pretending privacy still existed, to stop trusting systems that had been compromised long ago. The presentation ended with a choice. Ethan and Maya could walk away, continue their lives with the knowledge they'd gained, or they could join the collective, help spread the message, become part of what Mira Walker called the awakening. Their expertise was valuable, their story compelling, their brokenness authentic. They could be powerful voices for the truth. The laptops went dark. The warehouse remained silent. Ethan and Maya sat in that harsh light, processing what they'd seen, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. Ethan thought about his empty apartment, his failed marriage, his years of chasing shadows only to discover the shadows were real and everywhere. Maya thought about her destroyed reputation, the years she'd spent rebuilding, the cost of truth-telling in a world that preferred comfortable lies. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Maya stood, her chair scraping against concrete. "We should go. We need to think about this, decide what to do with the information." Ethan followed her out into the Chicago night, which had grown even colder while they'd been inside. Snow had started falling again, thick flakes that would cover their tracks within minutes. They walked back to their cars separately, maintaining operational security even now, perhaps especially now. Ethan sat in his car for a moment before starting the engine, watching Maya's taillights disappear into the snow. His phone buzzed with a final message from Mira Walker. "You've seen the truth. You can't unsee it. What you do next will define who you are. Choose wisely." In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Maya met several more times, always in public, always careful, discussing options that all felt inadequate. They could go to the authorities, but with what proof? Everything they'd experienced could be dismissed as elaborate hacking or psychological manipulation. They could try to expose Mira Walker publicly, but doing so would reveal their own compromised security, damage their credibility, possibly endanger others. They could join the collective, become insiders, but that meant endorsing methods they weren't sure they supported, becoming part of the very violation they'd sought to expose. Or they could do nothing, live with the knowledge, try to move forward. But forward to what? Ethan found himself less able to sleep, more paranoid, covering cameras on devices, speaking carefully even in his own home. Maya threw herself into other work, but her articles grew darker, more cynical, less hopeful about technology's promise. They'd been changed by what they'd seen, marked by knowledge they couldn't share and couldn't escape. The deep web had always been there, a layer beneath the surface of normal digital life. But now they understood it wasn't separate from reality. It was simply reality with the masks removed, showing the surveillance, control and vulnerability that existed everywhere, all the time, invisible only to those who chose not to look.